as you say this, Representative Berg, yesterday hundreds of Minneapolis businesses shut down as part of a general strike in opposition to ICE. Nearly 16,000 people protested in the streets, according to labor leaders, and dozens of clergy members were arrested at a peaceful sit-in at Minneapolis St. Paul Airport. Now, polls show the president's immigration purges losing support nationally. Do you think that popular opposition can force the administration to relent?
We are standing here.
We've been listening to a briefing from local Minnesota lawmakers and law enforcement about their efforts to keep the peace in Minneapolis after a fatal shooting of a resident by federal forces conducting immigration enforcement operations. While this was happening, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem held her own briefing on the incident in Washington. Let's take a listen to some of that.
It occurred with DHS law enforcement as they carried out their lawful duties to keep Americans safe in the threat of criminal illegal aliens in this country. At 9:05 a.m. Central Time, the Department of Homeland Security law enforcement officials and officers were conducting targeted operations in Minneapolis against an illegal alien whose criminal history included domestic assault with intentionally inflicting bodily harm, disorderly conduct, and driving without a valid license. An individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The officers attempted to disarm this individual, but the armed suspect reacted violently. Fearing for his life and for the lives of his fellow officers around him, an agent fired defensive shots. Medics were on the scene immediately and attempted to deliver medical aid to the subject, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The suspect also had 2 magazines with ammunition in them that held dozens of rounds. He also had no ID. This looks like a situation where an individual arrived at the scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and to kill law enforcement. About hundreds of protesters then showed up at the scene. They began to obstruct and to assault law enforcement officers. We saw objects being thrown at them, including ice and other objects, and a rampant assault began, and even an HSI officer agent's finger was bitten off. Crowd control measures were deployed to bring safety to the public and to law enforcement at the scene. And once again, I want to remind everybody that this situation and this tragedy did not have to happen. Our law enforcement are doing everything that they can to protect the public. We're praying for this deceased loved one's family and friends, but we also recognize that the Minnesota governor and the Minneapolis mayor need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. They need to evaluate their rhetoric, their conversations, and their encouragement of such violence against our citizens and our law enforcement officers. I'll remind you that Governor Walz today in his press conference said that our officers were not even law enforcement, which is a lie. He's called them the Gestapo. He's encouraged residents and citizens and violent rioters to resist. He's doxed their identities, putting themselves and their families' lives in jeopardy. He's refused to turn over murderers to federal law enforcement officers. He's protected illegal criminals and protected them from being brought to justice, and even overseeing...
Let's go back to the presser in Minnesota that is still ongoing.
And to remember these little kids who are afraid to go to school, and to remember the people who are legal citizens who are wrestled to the ground, yelling, "I am born here. I was born here." And to remember these 2 that we've lost. And I hope that's something that they all take home and that the people of this country do as they look at how they can get this administration to stop this.
Mayor Frank, can you talk about the legal case that you were pursuing and how this shooting changes your strategy? What is your best case scenario on Monday when you go to court?
Yeah. So there's 2 forms of request that we have been asking for. The first was this temporary restraining order. The other possibility is some form of injunctive relief. Now, I don't want to get too into the details because I'm bound to get something wrong, but the question is one of urgency and immediacy. The issue is that We recently saw somebody shot and badly injured. We then saw somebody shot and killed, and that was the second one. Chief, I think we've only had 3 homicides in the city this year. Is that right? 2 of them, ICE. 3 homicides. 2 of them were from ICE. And so the relief that we're asking for is stopping this Operation Metro Surge in the immediacy. It's preventing this massive influx of agents that is making it very difficult for us to do our jobs in the city as well as we need to do them, and we need to do regular day law enforcement as well. Yes?
They defied a search warrant this morning. Do you think they'll abide by a court order from the federal judge?
They have to abide. So the question is, they defied a search warrant this morning. Will they abide by a court order by a federal judge? Everybody listen to that question. The question is, will this administration abide by a court order? These are the underpinnings of our democracy, of our republic, and of this Constitution. The answer better be yes. Whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you abide by those court orders. The answer has to be yes if you are a patriot for this country. And so, yes, my expectation is that they will abide by the court order because there is not an alternative.
If I can just ask you, and also Senator Klobuchar and the other legislators, the rhetoric today seems back to where it was in the aftermath of Rene Good, if not even higher. Senator Klobuchar posted on X, Stephen Miller, then the president slammed Senator Klobuchar's post. I mean, this is going on, the vitriol on social media. Is there any way, or how are you going to come together? I mean, is there any way to approach the other side?
Yeah. I'll answer for myself and from the city's perspective, and certainly turn it to Senator Klobuchar. I want everyone to just quickly look at the juxtaposition between the way that Minneapolis is showing up and the way that the federal government is showing up. I want you to...
Many parents, teachers, students, and community members across parts of Minnesota say they are feeling a level of fear and anger they have never experienced before, especially after recent immigration enforcement actions that took place near homes, neighborhoods, and school communities. For many of them, the issue is not simply about immigration policy in the abstract, but about what they believe is happening in real time to families, children, and the basic sense of safety that schools are supposed to provide. Schools in the minds of these families are meant to be protected spaces where children can focus on learning, growing, and building their futures without worrying that something outside the classroom could suddenly disrupt their lives. When immigration officers are seen operating in areas closely connected to school communities, even if actions do not take place directly on school grounds, the emotional impact travels quickly through parents, students, and staff. Word spreads fast. Children hear rumors, parents panic, teachers try to calm classrooms filled with anxious questions, and an atmosphere of uncertainty replaces what used to be a sense of normal routine. Many residents say this emotional disruption is the core of their frustration because they feel the mission they have been told. Immigration enforcement service does not match what they believe they are witnessing in their neighborhoods. For years, people have heard that enforcement is meant to protect vulnerable communities and improve public safety, but critics in these Minnesota communities argue that the result they are seeing feels very different. They say that instead of feeling safer, families feel watched, worried, and uncertain about whether everyday activities like dropping a child off at school, going to work, or walking through their own neighborhood could lead to a life-changing encounter. This perception has grown stronger because children are involved, and when children are involved, emotions run deeper and reactions become more intense. Parents say that even if officers are not specifically targeting schools, the proximity of enforcement to school communities creates fear that spreads into classrooms, hallways, and homes. Teachers report that students are distracted, asking whether their friends will still be in class tomorrow or whether their own families are at risk. Administrators say they are spending more time responding to worried parents and less time focusing on education. In conversations across these communities, a common point often raised is research showing that undocumented immigrants, on average, are statistically less likely to commit crimes than many U.S. citizens. a fact that residents mention to argue that the presence of heavy enforcement in family neighborhoods feels out of proportion to the threat they believe exists. For these families, the question becomes not just about legality, but about priorities, proportionality, and the human cost of how policies are carried out on the ground. Many critics believe that the tone and intensity of current enforcement strategies reflect decisions made at the highest levels of political leadership and then carried downward through agencies and local operations. They argue that the effects of those decisions are felt most strongly not in political offices, but in living rooms, kitchens, school buses, and classrooms. At the same time, supporters of strict enforcement argue that laws must be applied consistently and that immigration authorities have a responsibility to carry out federal law regardless of local feelings, creating a sharp divide in how different groups interpret the same events. In Minnesota, this divide has become visible in protests, public meetings, school board discussions, and neighborhood gatherings where people speak passionately about what they believe is happening. Some residents are calling for changes to how and where enforcement actions occur, especially near areas connected to children, while others insist that making exceptions based on location could weaken the rule of law. The debate has also turned political, with some community members criticizing elected officials at both the federal and state level for supporting larger enforcement budgets while local families deal with the emotional fallout. People are asking why decisions made in Washington seem to have such a powerful impact on the daily emotional climate of small communities hundreds of miles away. For many, the issue is not framed as a debate about immigration numbers or border policy, but as a question about whether children should ever feel afraid in connection with their school environment. Parents describe trying to reassure their kids that school is still safe, even when those kids have seen news reports or heard stories from friends about families being detained. Teachers describe walking a delicate line between acknowledging students' fears and trying to maintain a calm learning environment. Community leaders describe a growing sense of mistrust between residents and federal authorities, which they worry could have long-term consequences beyond the current moment. They argue that when families begin to fear contact with any authority, they may hesitate to report crimes, seek help, or cooperate with officials, which could undermine public safety in a different way. Others counter that allowing fear to stop enforcement could create its own problems and send the wrong message about accountability. In the middle of this debate are the children who often do not fully understand the political or legal arguments, but clearly feel the emotional tension around them. Counselors report that some students show signs of anxiety, asking repetitive questions about whether their parents will be home when they return from school. Parents talk about changing routines, avoiding certain public places, and living with a constant sense of uncertainty. This atmosphere, critics say, is the opposite of what schools are supposed to represent. Schools are meant to be places of stability, predictability, and opportunity, where a child's main concern is homework, friends, and future goals, not immigration status or the fear of family separation. Many residents feel that this basic principle is being undermined, even if unintentionally, by the way enforcement operations are being carried out. They stress that their anger is not only about individual incidents, but about the overall feeling that their communities are being placed under a level of stress that they believe is unnecessary and harmful. Public meetings have become emotional, with parents speaking through tears about their children's fear and officials trying to explain the limits of their authority over federal actions. Religious leaders, nonprofit organizations, and local activists have stepped in to offer support, legal advice, and counseling to affected families. At the same time, national political figures have weighed in, either defending the enforcement as necessary or criticizing it as excessive, which has further intensified local feelings. Residents say they feel caught in the middle of a national political struggle that is playing out in their own neighborhoods. They question why their children's sense of safety has become part of a larger political debate. Some argue that there must be a way to enforce laws without creating fear around schools and family spaces, while others insist that enforcement by nature is uncomfortable and cannot be reshaped to avoid all distress. The emotional language used by critics reflects how deeply personal the issue has become for them. They speak of dignity, humanity, and the belief that children should never be exposed to scenes that make them feel their families are under threat. They emphasize that their communities include both citizens and non-citizens who have lived side by side for years, building friendships and trust, and that sudden enforcement actions feel like a shock to that social fabric. This sense of disruption has fueled protests, economic boycotts, and public demonstrations aimed at drawing attention to what residents describe as an urgent problem. In interviews and public statements, many parents repeat a simple idea. Whatever one's political views on immigration, schools should remain places of calm and protection for children. They believe that if enforcement actions create an atmosphere where children are afraid to attend school or worry constantly about their families, then something about the approach needs to be reconsidered. Supporters of enforcement respond that difficult situations are sometimes unavoidable when laws are being upheld, and that long-term safety depends on consistent application of the law. This back and forth has left communities emotionally exhausted, with no clear resolution in sight. What remains clear is the depth of feeling among parents, teachers, and students who say their daily lives have been changed by the presence and perception of immigration enforcement near their school communities. They continue to call for conversations about how policies are implemented, not just what the policies say on paper. They ask leaders to consider the psychological impact on children as part of any enforcement strategy. And above all, they return to the belief that schools should symbolize hope, learning, and security for every child who walks through their doors, regardless of background, rather than becoming places associated with fear, uncertainty, and political conflict.